Welcome to Posterity Podcast, a discussion of unusual subjects that touch the lives of everyday people from a Christian worldview. This is Mike Carmen sitting alongside Jay Carmen, coming to you without a suntan since summer is about over and I'm back teaching school. Jay, how are you? And have you recovered from eating that onion?
Yeah, I am good. I was telling him, Mike and I were just talking before we got online here. I think I ate one of those tainted onions that was circulating through the grocery stores last week. Got a bit of it on a sandwich and did not feel that great for a couple of days. But I'm good now.
Natural laxative, I bet, huh?
Yeah, you could say that, yeah.
Lost a few pounds, I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Well, all is well here in Middle Tennessee. We have started back to school with just a few COVID restrictions, and it's good to be back to see all the kids. I really missed them having to do distance learning the fourth quarter of last school year, so it's great.
Yeah, and school here has not started yet. They are holding off until here in Southwest Ohio. They're holding off until I think September the 8th is the day. And the reason is that here in our little town, these schools do not have air conditioning. So it's hot still here. And we will have a few more weeks of hot. And so they've delayed the start of the school year. And most families have the option, I believe all families have the option actually, to select whether they're going to go back, their students are going to go back to school, or if they're going to be virtual online. I think they have to be one or the other. At least that was, I haven't followed that story now in a couple of weeks, but that was the discussion about 10, 12 days ago. You could be one or the other, not a combination of the two. And I have no idea how many students are going back, how many are staying home.
But the schools don't have air conditioning?
Right. They have heat but no air conditioning.
Why is that?
I don't know. I don't know if it's...
I was thinking it's 2020. Surely all schools have air conditioning.
Yeah, exactly. I think actually that it may be that they just... Now, we have a couple of old elementary schools, one in particular here in the area that probably does not have air conditioning.
Oh, okay.
But it may just be that the units, that the central air is there, but it's inefficient.
Oh, okay.
And so they're just trying to keep everybody healthy and a little cooler for a little while longer.
Okay. Well, our podcast tonight is about favorite monster stories and favorite monster storytellers.
That's right.
And what did you select for tonight, Jay?
Well, I know you and I both listen to a number of not necessarily monster, but odd podcasts from time to time. And a few years ago, I started listening to a podcast called Saswhat.
Yes.
And in listening to that, it's not there anymore. It was hosted by the guys that, one of the guys, hosted by two guys, but one of them created Small Town Monsters, the documentary company. But in listening to Saswhat, I was reminded of this was a few years ago, reminded of my favorite monster story, which is the Minerva Monster. And for me, growing up in Canton Township, Canton local schools, right on the border of East Canton, for me, this had a particularly important, not effect, but had kind of impact. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for, because it took place about 10 miles from where Mike and I grew up. It was in the summer of 1978, and I had been traveling from my alma mater, working in church camps and churches for the summer. Came home for a couple of weeks right in the early part of August after we finished touring, and then went back to college for a couple of weeks. We always started before Labor Day, usually a week to 10 days, something like that. And it just so happened that in that particular summer, we'd been back at school not even 2 weeks, and some friends of mine decided that we would make a trip home. literally made a last minute decision to load up in a car and drive back to our home in Canton, Ohio. So we did.
Was this you and Todd that you roomed with?
Yeah, there was several of us at that time. I don't know, it's maybe not proper to name names, but I can think of 3 or 4 or 5. And we just all decided, I don't remember who made the decision. We said, let's just go home because
well, you can go ahead and name them. None of them would be embarrassed by this podcast.
no, not at all. Exactly. So
I'm just kidding.
we just decided we would just go. And that was great because we were coming home on Labor Day weekend. So we had the weekend off anyway. And there were no classes. I think we still went to school on Monday, Labor Day, but we left early on Friday and came home. But I remember that I called Dad and Mom to tell them, hey, we've made a last-minute decision. We're coming home this weekend. And, of course, we'd only been at school for probably about 2 weeks, maybe not even quite that. So it was like, it was just kind of a last-minute decision, and it was great because we knew once the school year started, we probably wouldn't get home again until Thanksgiving. So I called home and talked to Mom, talked to Dad. And Mom was really, she said, Dad didn't talk a lot on the phone. He said, Dad wants to get on the phone and tell you something. Okay. So he got on the phone and of course, they called me Buster back then. Hey, Buster. Hey, Bub.
Hey, Bubby.
Yeah, hey, Bub. Did you hear about the Bigfoot sighting that they had down in Minerva? There was a Bigfoot sighting there, and he said, I'll tell you about it, show you the newspaper article when you get home. And I was surprised. You think of that kind of a story coming out of the Pacific Northwest or Washington State or California or Oregon, but you do not think you would hear that kind of a story in Ohio. So I was kind of excited. We got home, and that Friday night, my friend Dave and I jumped into his bright orange, still brand new Volkswagen Beetle with it was orange with white trim.
That was a nice
white
car.
Leather interior, and a sunroof.
Yeah.
And we took Ray. I don't remember if you went or not.
No, I did not.
No, I think Mom.
I would have been about 8 years old at the time. So
yeah, we wouldn't have done that. Ray was.
I can remember growing up not being able to go Christmas caroling with you guys because I was too little, and the snowdrifts were so high. You all would tell me that, Mike, if we take you Christmas caroling, you'll probably get lost in the snowdrift and die. Like, oh no. So as a result, I couldn't go to Minerva and see Bigfoot, even though there were no snowdrifts. Yeah.
Or Bigfoot, actually, probably.
Right, yeah.
Who knows? But we just thought it would be interesting, Dave and I told Dave the story and told Kathy and Mom. Of course, Mom and Dad are not told Kathy. Kathy already knew about it, but Mom and Dad was showing me the newspaper article. And the way this unfolded, I should probably lay this out there, that Dad was excited because he had followed Bigfoot stories off and on for a few years, as had I. But this particular sighting was kind of unusual. It happened in Minerva, about 10 miles east of where we grew up, right on State Route 30. And it was intriguing because the story itself, the way it unfolded, this family near Minerva had problems with this thing that he said they used to, if you watch the Small Town Monster video documentary about this called The Minerva Monster, they called it the Hairy Witch, this thing that used to hang around the back of their property. And it had been hanging around off and on for years, not just their property, but others, but it had been bothering their home, and they ended up calling the sheriff. Sheriff went out, checked things out. And I'm not going to give the whole background of the story because I really think the Minerva Monster documentary done by Small Town Monsters does a great job of covering that. And I don't want to, no need to rehash that. But the story itself and the way it unfolded and the way it hit the news, we grew up in Canton. It did not make the Canton papers right away, even though it happened not far from the city of Canton, right there in Stark County, in a part of the townships where it should have been in the local paper. Instead, a reporter from the Akron Beacon Journal got wind of it.
Right.
And she came down, did the initial story. It went into the Beacon Journal. And when it got into the Beacon Journal, the AP Newswire picked it up. And when the AP Newswire picked it up, well, then the Canton Repository had to do something with it.
The Canton Repository said, "Oh, we're not covering news in our own backyard. We better get on the ball."
We got to go, man. So they published a story, and I think that's when Dad heard about it. And all of that transpired within a couple of weeks because the actual sighting took place in the latter part of August, and within that first couple of weeks, by then it had made it into the local paper. Dad heard about it, told us. So Dave and I, Ray, we jump in this Volkswagen VW, bright orange, 10 o'clock at night on a Friday night. I think it was Friday. It might have been Saturday. Hot. So we had the the sunroof down, and we're flying down State Route 30, going to Minerva, thinking we're going to watch for Bigfoot. We didn't see a thing.
Yeah.
But we had a blast.
Yeah.
We had a blast.
Did you actually drive by the property where it happened?
Yeah, but we didn't. They wouldn't. The newspaper didn't give the exact address. Or at least they probably did, but I don't remember it. And it was dark. I mean, we couldn't see. And their property, if you watch the video, sits back off the highway a bit. So we drove right past it, turned around, came back, probably drove past it again. It seems to me we drove in and out of Minerva a couple of times, just kind of being on the road, looking around. And other people had been doing the same thing. But what was kind of, it just hit me just how creepy it was in a sense, because it was dark. There's a lot of wooded areas between where we grew up on the eastern side of Canton and Minerva on that 10-mile stretch, places where the trees are kind of close in on the side of the road. So it was pretty dark. And Ray decided he stands up in the back seat and sticks his head out the sunroof. So now we're flying down State Route 30 in the dark in this little VW.
And he's got his arms out saying, "I'm the king of the world."
Yeah. And I didn't know he was doing it. I'm sitting there in the passenger seat talking to Dave, and I turn around, I was like, "Hey, get your head back in here. Mom will kill me if you get hurt." But it was fun, and it was a memory. It really was, obviously. And then for years after that, I never thought about it, didn't hear anything about it. I did see it in a book one time, probably 10, I don't even know how many years later, 10, 12 years later, I saw it in a book somewhere, just a brief recounting of that experience, that sighting. Until then, about 4 years ago, as I said, I'd been listening to the Sasquatch podcast, and Seth Breedlove, Mark Matsky hosted that podcast at the time. Seth Breedlove went on to found Small Town Monsters.
Right.
And they were talking about that video coming out because he had already begun the production on that. And I got interested and I looked it up, and sure enough, there was the Small Town Monsters group. There was the video from Minerva Monster, and ended up getting a copy.
Yeah.
So
that was their first documentary, wasn't it?
That was their first documentary.
Yeah. It was still very good.
It is very good.
They did a good job. Yeah.
And so it was just kind of cool. That's my favorite monster story.
And Small Town Monsters does a great job of telling that story.
They do.
They really do.
The other documentaries that they have since released on other unusual subjects, you have to go to their website and look them up, Small Town Monsters. They explain very well what they do. They document local lore, on unusual topics and subjects all over the United States. So I thought it was interesting. I thought it was an interesting story when it happened. I thought it was even more interesting when I saw the documentary. So I've been following their website, buying some of their other stuff, and would promote that for anyone who is interested. One thing I will add to the end of the story for me, I remember, and I was telling Barb, my wife, about this, that I remember that there was one night growing up, and I didn't relate these two at the time, but when I was in high school, you remember I had a paper route.
Right.
And so, junior, senior year, I delivered papers. And I remember, and on Friday nights, especially in the fall and in the summer, we would sometimes stay up late, watch Big Chuck and Houlihan, the Friday night horror films, monster movies at 11:30. And I remember one night staying up late and watching something, and before the movie came on, I had walked into that little room off of our kitchen to look out the back. And for those of you who are listening, we grew up in an old farmhouse. It was built, I don't remember, 20s or 30s, right on State Route 30, when that was still part of the Lincoln Highway. And the family that built it later built other houses around it, and they leased that house out. And we lived there for quite a while. And it was on what used to be farm property. So not long after we moved in the 60s, they bulldozed a lot of the trees behind the house because an oil company had found oil in the area, and they put in a well back there. So you could literally look out our back window beyond this old barn that used to stand there in the backyard, and into down the hill and down the long driveway past the well and into these deep, dark woods. And we would see hunters back there every once in a while, especially in the fall. And because of that, Mom was always, kind of, if you heard gunshots, I'd run for the house. Not that anything would ever happen, but it was just kind of really dark back there. I remember looking back there one night, and I'm pretty sure it was one of these nights we were going to stay up late and watch a movie. And it was dark, so it was probably late fall, maybe early winter, because the screen didn't have the window open. It was too cold for that. I remember looking back there, and I had just glanced out the window, and I saw a dark figure moving through the woods back there. Very
Really?
slowly. Yeah, very slow, kind of tall. For the longest time, I thought I imagined it, because it was, it didn't really move that fast, but it wasn't moving slow either.
So was this behind the oil well and then before you
Yes.
would get to the rest of the woods?
Yep, back in
Wow,
that
really?
swampy area back there, yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember looking back there and thinking, I'm just imagining this,
Yeah.
and kind of just, but it was kind of creepy. And then the second thing I thought was, we knew that, people that hopped the rails on the trains in that area sometimes slept and camped in those woods back there. We used to get, not where we were, but in that extended wooded area that went down and around and through the neighborhoods, back to the farther back streets. People would camp back there, and we would see hunters. We would see people hunting. So I thought at first I was seeing a hunter, and then I thought, man, it's awfully dark to be hunting. What are they hunting? And then it only lasted 3 or 4 seconds, and then it was gone. So very vague, very, very possible that it was, just shadows and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. But I remember that came to mind when you and I talked a few weeks ago about telling the Minerva Monster story. And I was talking to Barb about it, and I remembered that. I told her, I said, I hadn't thought about that in a long time, but that, of course, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I interviewed Seth Breedlove and Mark Matsky for a blog that I was writing at the time. And they asked me if I was aware of the fact that there had been other sightings in our area, actually. And
Really?
that there was one over by the old elementary school. And he actually
Over by Trump?
Yeah, not far from there. And he actually named the person.
Oh, is that the one on Leander Road?
Yeah.
That was in the early 70s, because I've seen that on the BFRO website.
Right.
Yeah, my friend Todd actually lived on the opposite side of Leander. Like if I remember correctly, Leander was on both sides of Trump Road.
Right.
And if you were going
on the right side,
I'm not sure which direction it would be, but if you were going, I guess it would have been north on Trump Road towards Trump Elementary School. Todd lived on the left side of Trump Road. Todd lived on the left side on Leander at the very end. And I think the Bigfoot sighting that's on the BFRO website happened on the other end of Leander.
Which was that's the far end of that wooded area that
right.
we grew up in.
Yeah. And there's farmland adjacent to it where that guy said he saw it.
Yeah. So, and of course, if you look at things geographically, there's so many different strip mines in an area where we grew up that you can kind of follow those, because the coal companies and the oil companies moved through that area for 40 years, 30, 40 years. And just, a lot of those areas, after they were done, the nature would reclaim it.
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
the dugout areas would remain. And I believe that that's, if there's a Bigfoot monster running around back through there, that's weird kind of properties. But anyway, that's what I remember. And that dark figure that I saw, that had to have been in 75 or 76. And then of course the
Okay.
Bigfoot sighting itself was in 1978.
Yeah. Yeah. I had read about that. I had read the sighting on the BFRO report on Leander Avenue. I don't know when I read that, but I was thinking that was around 74 or something like that. And I don't know that I ever told you about that. So it's interesting that you recall having seen some dark figure beyond the oil well, but before the rest of the woods. And I read that other report, and it could have very well been the same.
Could have been related to that
Yeah.
same time period or close to that same time period. And then, like I said, when I did the article interview on Small Town Monsters, they asked me if I knew they actually named the person, and I don't remember who it was, and I probably would not repeat it on the air, so to speak, but asked me if I knew that person and knew that story was back there. And I did not at that time. I did not know
I think we should name all of our friends on this podcast.
that.
We'll give people say, we don't know Jay and Mike. We don't know.
Yeah,
We don't know who they
that's
are.
right.
But the great thing about that story is that your recollections of it and how, your life and Ray and Dave and the rest of everyone in our family lives kind of interacted with it as a story as it was happening, because I remember when that happened. I guess I would have been about 8, maybe going on 9. And I remember 2 things. One was standing in the kitchen talking with Dad. It was after dark, and we were looking out the window in the kitchen that looked out over the driveway.
Mm-hmm.
And then we looked out the back window in the back of the kitchen on the right side, where that kitchen sink was, where that small kitchen sink was.
Mm-hmm.
And he was trying to explain to me that it most likely was not a bear, because of the amount of time that people said they saw this creature, whatever it was, walking upright. And
Right.
he said bears only stand upright to see what's ahead of them, and then they go back to walking on all fours. And the other memory that I have of that story is when you and Ray jumped in the VW with Dave to go out there that night. And I just remember that being a warm summer night.
Yeah, it was very warm.
Yeah, that's really cool.
It was cool. It was a neat experience, and Dave and I laughed about it, and Ray, all of us laughed about it. My only fear was when I turned around and saw him sticking up out of the top of that. My first thought was not he's going to get hurt, but I'm going to get killed when I get home.
Yeah. Driving down the road and get smacked in the head at night with a bat,
Yeah. Or Bigfoot,
That's right.
Coming for a ride.
That's funny. Well, my favorite story, I wish we had a closer connection to it, but one of my favorite stories is the Sasquatch Chronicles podcast episode titled The Chewbacca Man. It's episode 147. And the reason that I think I like this episode so much is the way the guy tells the story. He comes across to being very authentic. I think his name was Jason. And of course, he's talking to the host, Wes Germer, I think is his name. It's an episode, or it's an instance that took place in East Texas. I think he says his dad was a land developer in East Texas around Toledo Bend and the same Sam Rayburn Reservoir. So his dad would develop plots of land for campgrounds and things like that. And Jason, I think he said his name was, grew up in a small town in deep East Texas around the Sabine and Angelina National Forest. He says just above the Big Thicket. And you can see this description on SasquatchChronicles.com, episode 147, the Chewbacca Man. But I think the reason I like this story so much, and I'll just give you a few points about the story here in a minute, but I think the reason I like it so much is because as a child, I had a very unusual experience with a friend of mine when I was about 8 or 9 years old. He would have been about 11 or 12. Now, mine wasn't a terrifying experience. It was a little creepy. It was a little odd. But listening to this story about these two kids talk about seeing this Bigfoot reminds me of the fact that children often experience, obviously terrifying things and even evil things, but they often experience terrifying natural things or even creepy things. And when they go tell their parents or their older siblings about it, sometimes they get brushed aside. They get blown off. Oh, that's not what happened to you. You just, you just imagined that, or you just experienced, something else. I say that because when I was growing up, I had a friend named Bobby, and Cindy, our sister, had a friend named Kara. And Bob was just a year or two older than I was, and Kara was in the same grade as Cindy. But we went over to their house one summer night, and we were playing outside as the sun was setting. There was still plenty of daylight. And I remember their mom, Bob and Kara's mom, coming out and spraying us down with mosquito repellent because we were playing outside, and they had a lot of woods where they lived. And so Bobby and I are talking, and he goes, "Hey, do you want to see where the UFO landed?" I said, "What?" And have I ever told you this story?
No, I have never heard this before. Listeners, this is a first for all of us.
Bobby tells me this. He says, "Hey, do you want to go see where the UFO landed?" And I said, "Okay." So we walked back into the woods behind his house, and I don't remember how far we went or how deep into the woods it was. It couldn't have been very far, but we came upon a clearing, a kind of a large circular area as I remember it. And it was basically tall grass and weeds. And you could see where the weeds had been laid down in a circular fashion. And there's
You're
woods.
pulling my leg. You never
No,
told me that.
I'd forgotten about this. I'm not lying about this at all. And of course, this was 1978, 1979, around in there. It may have been before that, but yeah, we walk into this opening, and there's this small clearing of woods with high grass and weeds, and you can see where it looked like the wind had laid it down. And that's what I really remember. I don't remember, the grass being brown or being dry or baked down to the ground or anything like that. What it reminded me of when I saw it was when you would walk behind our house, you would walk through the backyard and then started the weed field on both sides of the driveway that went down towards the oil well.
Mhm.
Well, when we would have heavy winds, you could stand in the kitchen or in one of those two back rooms in the back of the house that overlooked the garage, and you could see the backyard and the weed field, and you could see where the wind had laid down the weeds.
Right.
Like
Yeah, I remember that, sure.
And that's what it reminded me of. And we go back there, and he shows this to me. He says, "Yeah, this is where the UFO landed, or the spaceship landed." And I don't remember anything about the conversation after that. If I asked him, "Did you see it?" or something like that. And that's really all I remember. But it was one of those experiences as a kid that was unusual, a little creepy, and I really didn't know what to do with it. I
Right.
didn't have a category for that. To me, it just looked like the wind laid it down, but who knows? He may have been trying to creep me out. And and I said, "Oh man, it just looks like the wind blew the weeds down. It doesn't look like a UFO landed there." But in this episode of the Sasquatch Chronicles, this guy named Jason calls, and he recalls an experience in East Texas when he's about 11, and this little boy named TJ, I think he says, is about 9. I guess both of these guys, their dads were surveyors and developers, and Jason said his dad would take him to go see this developer that he worked with. And because this other guy had a little boy named TJ who was about 9, they would play together. Well, evidently, these kids are playing in the backyard in a dirt pile. And the younger boy who lives there looks at Jason and goes, says, "Hey, you see that trail right there?" And he had this trail at the back of his backyard, and it was a trail that went into the woods. And the kid says, "Yeah." And he says, "Chewbacca Man lives back there, or Chewbacca lives back there." And of course, this is post Star Wars because, nobody would know what a Chewbacca was right before that. And he says, "You want to go see it?" Kid goes, "Well, yeah, sure." And so he says they walk a good ways back into the woods down this trail. And he says they get so far, and he said you could see candy wrappers where this kid TJ had been opening up candy. Who knows what it was
Snack
towards
bags and stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Hostess,
See?
whatever.
Mhm.
He said, if I remember correctly, he says this little boy TJ starts making a whooping sound. And the kid's like, "What? What are you doing?" And he makes this whooping sound. And he makes it again and again. And he said, the next thing you know, you hear these these crashing footfalls coming through the woods towards them. And, the kid's like, okay, this is probably just a horse, or something, And he said this thing just gets closer and closer. And they come into visual range of it. And he says, you can see this is not a horse. It's not a bear. It's not a goat. It's some large hairy creature. And this kid starts to, his blood pressure goes up. He starts to breathe in heavy. And this kid, TJ, and it almost sounds like a horror movie, the way he describes it. He says, the kid, TJ, looks at the other kid and goes, "Oh, he doesn't like it that you're here." Like, "Oh, thanks, man. You invited me back here, and now you're gonna let this thing kill me. You're gonna
That's right.
terrorize me with it." And he said, this Sasquatch, whoever it was, it starts, just getting angry and making, heavy wind, pushing air out of his lungs, and he starts pulling dead limbs off of a tree. And I guess this kid, he just freaks out. So he gets scared and he starts running back up that trail towards this other kid's house. And he said this other kid's like, no, don't run, don't run. Well, he said this creature started to chase him. And this kid is just running for his life. And I can only imagine how terrifying this is. And he said this creature actually started to circle around him to come around and intercept him from the front, I guess. And he said as he got closer and closer to where the house was, he started screaming for his dad. And he said once he started screaming for his dad, this thing just stopped on a dime and wouldn't pursue him anymore. And he said he ran back to the house. He's just completely exhausted. And he goes to the house and he starts telling his dad and his friend's dad what happened. And the little boy TJ comes back and he's not saying a word because evidently, his dad doesn't know what's going on, that he's seeing this creature back there. And so Jason's dad tells him, says, "Just go wait in the car. We're almost done. You're okay." And so he goes and sits in the car, and the little boy TJ comes up to the car, and the other kid rolls down the window and says, "I told you, it's Chewbacca Man." And the way this guy tells this story, it's like so creepy. It's almost like the little boy TJ's got like dark black eyes or something. He goes,
Yeah.
"I told you, it's Chewbacca Man lives back there. I told you not to run." And evidently he says, this little boy just plays it really cool, and he doesn't confirm or deny his friend's story in front of his dad or his friend's dad. And I'm like, man, this kid set him up. And this kid's dad has no clue that he's going back there deep into the woods with who knows what, a box of Hostess, and he's feeding this creature, and he's made friends with it, and this creature doesn't like anybody else but this kid. And I just thought, whoa, what a creepy story.
Yeah,
Can you
good
imagine your
grief.
friend saying, "Hey, you want to go see Chewbacca, man? Oh, he doesn't like you. You better watch it."
That's crazy. I have listened to that story, but I hadn't thought about it in a while until you and I were talking about this. And
Yeah,
the guy tells the story really well.
he does.
And, like anybody that does podcasting, I'm sure there's a certain amount of editing that goes on where you clean up sound quality and do like we do and try to cut out as many of the
Yeah,
that kind of stuff. But
which we're not doing for this episode. Sorry,
no,
people.
that's right. But the it is just an unusual story.
It's a creepy story.
Yeah, it is. I think it would be cool if at the end of this we put links up to Sasquatch Chronicles, Small Town Monsters, so people who maybe have never heard of them or followed those podcasts or shows or Small Town Monsters is actually a production company. They also run a website, or excuse me, run a podcast called Monsteropolis, which is
very good.
It is very good, and they talk about Seth Breedlove, Mark Matsky talk about certain subjects. They also talk about the trips that they take to make these documentaries.
Yeah.
Which is just, I don't know, it's a fascinating process. I was listening the other day, last week actually. Barb looked at me and said, "Do you wish you had done that kind of stuff?" Or no, what did she say? She said, "Do you wish you could go travel with them sometime?" And I said, yeah, kind of maybe. But I said, really, what I wish is that when I was their age, I had maybe thought to look into some of this just a little bit, instead of waiting until I'm in my 60s, and talking about it. But it's an interesting, the Chewbacca Man. For those of you that can go, we'll go there. You should listen to the story. There is they have some creepy stories. They do.
They really do.
Yeah, the opening sound segment is a series of clips of people telling their stories, and they include a 911 call that you just have to hear. And then if you can, and I can never think of the episode, he does interview the guy that called in that 911 call. But I think it's on their members only site, the full story. Not everything that's on Sasquatch Chronicles is available to just the listener who happens to drop by. They have a member site, and there's a lot more there.
Yeah, it seems to be worth it too.
Yeah. Wes Germer does a great job of just getting people to talk about their stuff.
And he's a great interviewer because he does more listening than he does talking.
Right.
And he really lets people walk through their story. Yeah.
Right.
He's really good at what he does. Well, these are two of our favorite scary stories told by scary storytellers. And we'll actually have to do this again.
Yeah, I think we should.
I actually have a few other stories. Some of which I generally speaking, I like the Sasquatch Chronicles. And I think probably the majority of the people that he interviews are the real deal. I think they're telling true stories.
Mm-hmm.
I do have some other stories from some movies that I've seen that I think are based in real life that I'd like to talk about. But yeah, this was a good idea.
Yeah, very. And honestly, folks, when we talk about this, check out smalltownmonsters.com. Check out Monsteropolis. Monster. You have to edit that part out. Check out smalltownmonsters.com. Check out Monsteropolis, the podcast produced by Small Town Monsters. Go to the Small Town Monsters website. Buy their stuff. Buy their videos. They're also on Amazon, streaming. And then visit SasquatchChronicles.com, the podcast and member-only website, and take some time to think about especially what Sasquatch Chronicles does. They do a good job of just letting people talk.
Yeah.
And tell their story.
I also want to throw out the podcast of a friend of mine that I work with. His name is Jeff Wright. He has a podcast called Saw Something Scary Podcast, and you can find it at sawsomethingscary.com. He's been doing it since 2017, and he and a good buddy of his have these discussions about movies that they have seen. And I am not a fan of horror movies. I've seen only a few because they really do scare me too much. But Jeff is really good. I told him this the other day. I said, you're really good at analyzing culture and bringing to bear the gospel to understand what's going on in culture. He and a friend of his are watching scary movies that are classic. Some of them are, new in the theaters, and they're giving really intelligent commentary on the quality of these movies and the quality of the stories being told and the directors and actors in them. So if you get a chance, go over and listen to Saw Something Scary podcast. I have listened to it for a few movies that I have seen, and because of their conversation, I'm actually going to go watch The Shining with Jack Nicholson. Have you ever seen that?
No.
No, and I'm not gonna.
Sandra
has seen it.
Not a
Sandra has
Stephen
seen
King
it, and
fan.
I'm going to go ahead and watch it. But I would like to get Jeff and his buddy to make some commentary on some other kinds of scary stories, like the kinds of things that we're talking about. And I'd like for him to bring his analysis to bear on that sort of thing. So anyway, that's another great podcast you can listen to, sawsomethingscary.com.
Yeah.
Well, that's all I got.
That's all we got tonight, folks. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back sometime in the near future with something else to say that maybe you do or don't want to listen to, but we find them interesting.
That's right.
You're
thinking, hey, man, this podcast ran 40 minutes long. I don't care what you got to say about anything.
Mike and I are both preachers and have done preaching, and we very much understand the mindset of the listener, which is if you can't say what you got to say in 20 minutes, if you don't strike oil, stop boring. Yeah. The mind can only take in what the seat can endure. So, we really do respect that. But when it comes to talking about some of these things, it's a little harder to narrow down the story time. So, thank you for listening.
Yeah. And hey, folks, we're going to go out with Ray Carmen's Hamana Hamana coming at you. And go to raycarmenmusic.wixsite.com, WIXSITE.com. raycarmenmusic.wixsite.com. That's all, everybody. Take care. Thanks for listening.